welcome. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Or, I might show up at your door. I'm just here to share some creepy stories, so sit back and enjoy. Disclaimer: the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. The first emergency alert came through my radio just after dusk. At first, I barely noticed it. Just another shrill, monotone beep interrupting the AM static as I drove through Willow Creek's backroads. But when the automated voice came through, something about it felt off. The tone was calm, measured, yet eerily devoid of context, as if whoever recorded it didn't quite understand the weight of their own words. Emergency alert. Do not listen to the sound of crickets. Avoid prolonged exposure. Remain indoors. Further instructions to follow. I frowned, glancing at my radio. What the hell? Outside, the sky was bruised with the last hints of daylight. The thick tree line on either side of the road casting shadows that swallowed my truck's headlights. I had been driving for hours, making my way to the Willow Creek field station for a research trip. Nothing more than a week alone in the woods, monitoring insect populations and tracking behavioral shifts in local wildlife. The emergency alert repeated itself, the words identical. There was no mention of a storm, no wildfire, no missing person or escaped convict, just a cryptic warning about crickets. I turned the volume down and exhaled, trying to push away the unease curling in my gut. I'd studied crickets for years. Their chirps were nothing more than a byproduct of stridulation, a simple mechanical process where they rubbed their wings together to produce sound. There was nothing inherently dangerous about them, no evolutionary reason for their calls to pose a threat. So why the hell was the emergency alert system treating them like a biohazard? I shook my head and kept driving. By the time I reached the field station, a small wooden cabin nestled at the edge of a clearing. The sun had dipped below the horizon. The air was thick with the sound of insects, the steady rhythm of crickets rising and falling in an almost hypnotic pattern. I hesitated before stepping out of the truck. I wasn't sure if it was the alert lingering in my mind, but the crickets, they sounded different tonight. Normally, the chirps were a chaotic mess of overlapping frequencies, each male calling out to potential mates with its own distinct rhythm. But this was too synchronized. Like every single cricket in the area was calling at the exact same tempo. I shook the thought away and grabbed my gear, making my way inside. The field station was exactly as I had left it months ago. Dusty bookshelves lined with insect field guides, old maps tacked to the walls, and a cluttered desk covered in notebooks and recording equipment. I set up my laptop and checked my messages. No new emails, no updates from the National Weather Service. Nothing that might explain the emergency alert. Annoyed, I pulled out my portable recorder and stepped onto the porch. If there was some strange anomaly affecting the crickets' calls, I wanted to document it. Holding the recorder out, I hit record. The chirping poured in, an almost mechanical rhythm pulsing through the night air. It was bizarre, perfectly evenly spaced, each chirp falling into place like the ticking of a clock. I muttered to myself, adjusting the settings. Weird. Then, as if responding to my voice, the crickets stopped. Every single one. Silence crashed over the forest like a tidal wave. I swallowed, suddenly hyper-aware of the weight of my own breathing. I had spent years studying insect communication, but I had never heard an entire population of crickets stop all at once. Not like this. I turned the recorder off and stepped back inside, shutting the door. Maybe I was just overanalyzing things. Maybe the alert had just put me on edge. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. The ranger station. The unease stayed with me throughout the night. By morning, I had convinced myself that I was being ridiculous. Sleep deprivation, a long drive, and a weirdly timed emergency alert. None of it meant anything. I decided to visit the Willow Creek Ranger Station to see if anyone else had heard the broadcast. The station was about 6 miles away, nestled deeper into the forest. By the time I arrived, the morning mist had settled thick between the trees, curling around the cabins and radio towers like pale smoke. Ranger Dan Holloway, a grizzled man in his early 50s, looked up from his desk as I entered. "Elias, didn't think you'd be back until spring." I set my bag down and pulled up a chair. "Got here last night. Did you hear the emergency alert?" Dan exhaled sharply. "Yeah, we all did. Local law enforcement's been getting calls all night." "About what?" Dan hesitated. His jaw tightened like he was holding something back. "People say the crickets sound weird. Some claim to hear voices mixed in with the calls." I felt a chill creep up my spine. "That's impossible. Crickets don't." "We found a body this morning," he cut in. I blinked. "What?" "Out near Millstone Road. No wounds, no signs of a struggle. Just dead." And his ears were bleeding. I stared at him. "You think it's connected to the alert?" Dan shrugged, but I could see the unease in his expression. "I don't know what to think, Elias. All I know is that the crickets are louder than I've ever heard them. And last night, dispatch got a call from some kid saying her dad walked into the woods after hearing them talk to him." A heavy silence settled between us. Finally, Dan stood and grabbed his jacket. "I was about to head out there." "You coming?" I hesitated. Every logical part of me wanted to dismiss this as superstition, some weird auditory illusion, maybe an environmental shift affecting insect behavior. But something deep in my gut told me this was something else, something worse. I grabbed my recorder and followed him out the door. As we drove toward Millstone Road, the crickets started chirping again. And this time, I could swear I heard something hidden beneath the sound. A voice, whispering, "Come outside. Listen. Join us." The trees pressed in around the truck as we made our way toward Millstone Road, the gravel crunching under the tires. The deeper we drove, the more I became aware of the crickets. Their chirping wasn't just loud, it was wrong. I adjusted the settings on my portable recorder, trying to isolate the frequency. The rhythmic pulsing of the insects was still eerily synchronized, each chirp striking at precise intervals, like metronomes in perfect unison. "Are they always this loud?" I muttered. Dan, gripping the steering wheel tighter than necessary, shook his head. "No, not like this." His voice was flat, but I could hear the unease beneath it. For a man who had spent decades patrolling these woods, Dan wasn't one to spook easily. We reached the site within minutes. The road was cordoned off with yellow police tape, and a single cruiser was parked nearby. A deputy stood guard, a younger guy, mid-20s, nervously shifting from foot to foot. He looked like he hadn't slept. Dan rolled down the window. "What's the situation?" The deputy swallowed hard. "Sheriff's inside the perimeter. They want you to see this." Dan exchanged a glance with me before shutting off the engine. As we stepped out, the crickets stopped. Just like last night, the sudden silence was suffocating. Dan muttered a curse under his breath. I felt my own pulse quicken as we walked toward the crime scene. The body had been moved already, but the outline remained. An indentation in the dirt, surrounded by scuff marks. Sheriff Marlene Vickers was crouched nearby, her brow furrowed as she examined something on the ground. She glanced up as we approached. "Dr. Mercer," I nodded. "Sheriff, I heard you found something unusual." "That's one way to put it." She stood and gestured toward a small pool of blood in the dirt, thick, dark, and coagulated. "It's from the victim," she continued. "Came out of his ears, nose, and eyes. Coroner says there were no signs of trauma, no struggle. It's like his brain just shut off." I knelt beside the stain, frowning. "Aneurysm, maybe. But here's the weird part." She pointed a few feet away, where a small black cricket lay motionless in the dirt. Every time someone approaches the scene, the crickets go quiet. But this little guy, it just dropped dead right next to the body. A chill ran down my spine. Dan exhaled sharply. "Jesus." I pulled on a pair of gloves and carefully picked up the cricket, examining it. It looked completely normal. No visible damage, no signs of decay, but something about it felt off. I turned to the sheriff. "Do you mind if I take this with me?" She nodded. "Be my guest. Just let me know what you find." As I placed the cricket into a sample bag, the distant hum of chirping resumed. But something had changed. The rhythm was different now. More erratic, almost like speech. The others heard it too. I could see it in the way Dan stiffened, in the way the deputy swallowed nervously. Sheriff Vickers cleared her throat. "All right, I don't like standing around out here. If this is some environmental thing, we need answers sooner rather than later." I agreed. We left the scene quickly, but as we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. A man was standing at the tree line. He wasn't moving, just watching, and even through the distance, I could swear his lips were moving, whispering in time with the crickets. The recording. Back at the ranger station, I wasted no time analyzing the recording I had taken in the truck. I plugged my laptop into my field equipment, adjusting the audio levels and isolating the cricket sounds. The waveform was bizarre. Normally, cricket chirps formed a scattered, messy pattern. But here, the frequencies were evenly spaced, mathematically precise. It was unnatural. I adjusted the playback speed, slowing it down. That's when I heard it, a faint whisper beneath the chirping. A voice, buried in the layers of sound. My blood ran cold. I adjusted the settings further, filtering out the high-pitched frequencies. The whisper became clearer. "Come outside." The voice was soft, almost melodic. I swallowed hard, pulse hammering in my ears as I looped the audio. "Come outside. Listen. Join us." I yanked my headphones off, my breath coming fast. The room felt smaller all of a sudden, the shadows pressing in. Dan, who had been sitting nearby, gave me a concerned look. "What is it?" I hesitated. "There's something in the recording." I played the altered clip for him. As soon as the whisper filtered through the speakers, Dan paled. "Jesus Christ," he muttered. "That's not possible." "I know," I said, but the evidence was right in front of us. The crickets weren't just making noise. They were transmitting something that could kill. I rubbed my temples, trying to think. What if the crickets are acting as conduits for something else? Some kind of frequency interference. Ultrasonic signals we can't normally hear. Dan exhaled slowly. "I don't know, Elias, but I'll tell you one thing. If this is real, the government's gonna be all over it." I stared at the screen, heart pounding. I had no idea how right he was. The second emergency alert. As the night wore on, I kept analyzing the data, trying to make sense of the crickets' patterns. The whispers, the synchronized chirps, there had to be an explanation. At around 1:13 a.m., my radio crackled again. Another emergency alert. Emergency alert. Avoid all natural sounds. Seal windows. Do not attempt to communicate with individuals who respond to the sound. I sat up straight, my skin prickling. Dan, who had been dozing in his chair, bolted awake. "What the hell?" Then, from outside, we heard the sound of footsteps. Slow, shuffling steps moving toward the station. Dan grabbed his flashlight and approached the window. "Someone's out there." I joined him, peering through the glass. A man was standing in the clearing. I recognized him instantly. It was the same man from the tree line, but something was wrong. His posture was too stiff, his head tilted at an unnatural angle. And then, in the eerie silence of the night, he opened his mouth. No words came out, only the sound of crickets. Dan cursed, stumbling back. My blood turned to ice. I reached for the radio, but before I could even touch it, the crickets screamed. A high-pitched, ear-splitting wail tore through the night, rattling the windows and sending white-hot pain lancing through my skull. The world blurred, my vision tunneling, and just before everything went black, I swear I heard the whisper again. "Come outside." The sound was everywhere, a deafening, shrill wail, crickets screaming. It wasn't just chirping anymore. It was a jagged, piercing frequency that cut through my skull like a hot needle. I clutched my ears, staggering back from the window. My vision blurred, black spots swimming at the edges. Beside me, Dan collapsed to his knees, groaning in pain. The man outside wasn't moving. He stood rigid in the clearing, his mouth still open, his throat convulsing with each unnatural sound. His eyes were locked on mine, unblinking, too wide. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. Something about the way he stood, the way his mouth vibrated with each chirp, it was like my brain was fighting to process what I was seeing. My body screamed at me to run, but I felt rooted to the spot, paralyzed. Then, as suddenly as it began, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Dan gasped beside me, panting like he'd just surfaced from deep water. My head throbbed. Every nerve in my body was on fire. Slowly, I forced myself to look outside again. The man was still there, but something had changed. His head twitched. Once, twice. Then, in a series of sharp, unnatural movements, he took a step forward. Dan swore under his breath. What the hell is wrong with him? I didn't have an answer. I watched in horrified fascination as the man moved closer, his body stiff like a marionette on tangled strings. He was trying to speak. His lips moved, his throat strained, but no human words came out. Only crickets, a rapid, pulsing burst of chirps, clicking and whining in a grotesque mimicry of speech. Dan scrambled to his feet. "We need to go. Now." I didn't argue. We bolted for the back door, my mind barely keeping up with what was happening. The emergency alert had warned us. Avoid the sound. Don't engage with those who respond to it. This man, whatever was left of him, had heard the crickets, and now he wasn't human anymore. Into the night, we ran to Dan's truck, practically throwing ourselves inside. He fumbled with the keys, hands shaking as he turned the ignition. The headlights flared to life, illuminating the clearing. The man was closer now, barely 10 feet away, his head cocked unnaturally to one side, his mouth still moving. The chirping sound didn't stop. Dan slammed the truck into reverse, tires skidding on the dirt as we peeled out of the station's lot. The headlights briefly swung across the trees, and for just a second, I thought I saw something else. Shapes, figures standing just beyond the tree line. More of them, watching. Then we were gone, speeding down the road, the sound of crickets fading behind us. Neither of us spoke for a long time. I pressed a hand to my forehead, my skull still aching from the sound. It had been more than noise. It had been something else, something that got inside your head. Dan finally broke the silence. "We need to call Vickers." I nodded, pulling out my phone. The signal was weak, but I managed to get through. The sheriff answered on the second ring. "Vickers," I swallowed hard. "Sheriff, it's Mercer. Something happened at the station." She was silent for a moment. Then, "Describe it." I did. Everything. The crickets. The man. The sound that nearly split our skulls in half. When I finished, her voice was grim. "You need to get to the precinct. Now." I exhaled. "What's going on, Sheriff?" Another pause. Then she said something that made my stomach drop. "It's not just here. We're getting calls from all over the county. People are hearing things, seeing things." I gripped the phone tighter. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that I just got off the phone with the National Guard." Dan and I exchanged looks. "The Guard?" Before I could ask anything else, Vickers continued. "And Mercer?" She hesitated, lowering her voice. "You said the man outside was speaking in chirps?" "Yeah." My mouth felt dry. "Why?" The sheriff exhaled slowly. "We just got a report from a woman in town. Her husband went missing last night. He left the house after hearing the crickets, and when she tried to follow, she trailed off." My grip on the phone tightened. "Sheriff." Her next words sent a fresh wave of horror through me. She said he called her name from the woods, but the voice that answered wasn't human. The line went dead. The town falls silent. The town was nearly deserted when we arrived. Shops had their lights off, doors locked. The streets were empty, and the only sound, even in the dead of night, was the crickets. But they were quieter now, not gone, just waiting. Dan parked outside the sheriff's office and we hurried inside. Vickers was waiting for us, along with a handful of deputies. Some were armed. Others looked pale, shaken. "We don't have much time," Vickers said. "We've been getting reports all night. People vanishing, others coming back. Wrong. I felt a sickening twist in my stomach. Like the man at the station? She nodded. Dan frowned. And the guard? What exactly did you tell them? Vickers hesitated. That something's happening. That it's affecting people's minds. They think it might be an airborne toxin, but I told them. A loud thud cut her off. We all froze. The sound had come from outside. Slowly, Dan moved to the window, peering through the blinds. I already knew what he was going to say before he whispered it. They're here. I took a deep breath and forced myself to look. A group of people was standing outside the sheriff's station. Maybe 10, maybe more, standing perfectly still. Their heads were tilted, their mouths moving in unison. And the sound that came out wasn't speech. It was chirping, rhythmic, constant, like the ticking of a clock. The hair on my arms stood on end. One of them, a woman in a nightgown barefoot, took a step forward. She lifted a hand and pressed her palm flat against the glass. A whisper drifted through the night air. Come outside. The lights flickered. The crickets began to scream. And then the power cut out. The darkness swallowed the room whole. For a moment, nobody moved. The only sound was the distant, rhythmic chirping, growing louder, filling the air like a pulsing heartbeat. Pressed against the windows, seeping through the walls. Then a voice, soft, measured. Flashlights. Now, Sheriff Vickers. I fumbled in my bag, fingers trembling as I yanked out my flashlight and clicked it on. A narrow beam of light cut through the shadows, illuminating the office in cold, artificial white. The others followed. One by one, deputies and rangers lit up the room with handheld beams and flickering emergency lanterns. The station's old generator hadn't kicked in, which meant the entire power grid was down. Dan cursed under his breath. They're still out there. I turned toward the window, heart hammering. The people outside hadn't moved. They stood motionless in the parking lot, silhouetted by the faint glow of the moon. Their eyes were wide and glassy, mouths moving as they continued their grotesque, insect-like chattering. And then, all at once, they turned. The entire group shifted in perfect unison, their heads snapping toward the same point in the distance. Something in the trees. A figure stood just beyond the tree line, half hidden by the shadows. It was taller than the others. The shape was off. Then, as my flashlight passed over it, the figure scuttled away. Not walked, scuttled, fast, too fast. A sharp, skittering motion that made my stomach lurch. My breath caught in my throat. What the hell was that? One of the deputies, a younger guy named Ramirez, whispered. His flashlight was shaking in his grip. No one answered, because none of us knew. The National Guard arrives. The silence stretched on. The people outside stood motionless for another few minutes. Then, as if responding to some unheard signal, they turned and began to walk. Slow, steady steps. They disappeared into the streets. Gone. The crickets stopped. And then, the sound of distant helicopters. Sheriff Vickers grabbed her radio. That's them. Within moments, 2 military trucks rolled into the station's lot, headlights cutting through the dark. Armed soldiers spilled out, moving with quick precision. One of them, a man in a black tactical uniform, no visible insignia, approached the building. Who's in charge here? His voice was calm, authoritative. Vickers stepped forward. Sheriff Marlene Vickers. We've got. I know what you've got. His eyes swept the room, landing on me. Dr. Elias Mercer, correct? I hesitated. Yes, the man nodded. We've read your reports. You're coming with us. Cold knot formed in my gut. Why? The man didn't answer. Instead, he turned to his team. Secure the perimeter. No one in or out. Something was very, very wrong. The military's warning. Inside one of the trucks, they had equipment set up. Monitors, audio analyzers, radio equipment. Everything was already scanning for frequencies. One of the screens showed a map of the region. Red dots blinked in clusters across it. I leaned closer. What is this? The soldier who had spoken earlier, his name tag read Harris, studied me for a moment, then sighed. Incidents. People affected by whatever the hell this is. Dan was beside me, arms crossed. "You're saying this is spreading?" Harris didn't respond right away. Instead, he tapped a few keys, pulling up an audio file. The sound of crickets, but beneath it, a voice, a garbled, overlapping whisper. The same one from my recording. "Come outside. Listen. Join us." I shuddered. Harris turned to me. "You asked why we need you. Here's the truth. This isn't the first time we've seen something like this." I froze. "What?" The room felt colder. Harris continued, his voice lowering. "There have been incidents over the years. Reports of certain frequencies affecting human behavior. Sound waves that trigger changes." My mind raced. "You mean like infrasound?" "Not exactly." He sighed. "More like something using sound as a carrier. Something embedding itself into the signal." A deep, uneasy silence settled over the room. Dan exhaled. "You mean like a virus?" Harris's expression was unreadable. "Maybe, but if that's the case, it's not biological. It's something else. And whatever it is," he gestured toward the monitors, "it's spreading fast." A heavy weight settled in my chest. I thought about the man at the station, his empty eyes, his broken, twitching movements, and the thing in the trees. Something worse was out there, something we still didn't understand. Lockdown. By the time we stepped outside, the military had begun sealing off the town. Checkpoints were being set up, barricades, roads blocked. An entire section of Millstone County was under quarantine. Sheriff Vickers looked furious. "You think you can just come in here and we're containing the situation." Harris cut her off, his voice firm. "For your safety, and for the safety of everyone else." I exhaled, my thoughts spinning. If they were locking down the area, that meant this wasn't going away anytime soon. The sun was rising now, a dull gray light creeping over the horizon. The town looked wrong, too still, too empty. Dan was watching the tree line. "Something doesn't feel right." I followed his gaze. Then I saw it, the figure, standing at the very edge of the forest. It wasn't moving, just watching. A terrible feeling crept up my spine. The longer I stared, the worse it got. It wasn't just a person. It was taller, too thin. His proportions were off. And when the wind shifted, when the distant sound of crickets rose once more, the figure bent backward, a snapping, jerking movement, like an insect folding in on itself. A hollow clicking sound filled the air, and then it was gone, vanished into the trees. My breath caught in my throat. Dan took a step back. "Elias!" I turned, heart pounding, because all around us, from the trees, from the rooftops, from the shadows of the town, they were watching. More figures, dozens of them, their mouths moving, chirping, and just before the sound engulfed us, before the screaming began again, a single emergency alert flashed on every phone, every radio, every working screen in town. A final warning. Emergency alert. The signal is adapting. They are no longer just listening. They are learning. Then the crickets screamed. The crickets screamed. It wasn't just noise anymore. It was everywhere. A jagged, piercing shriek that dug into my skull like broken glass. My vision swam, a crushing wave of nausea rolling through me. The figures in the trees didn't move. They just stood there watching, their mouths still moving, clicking in a grotesque, insect-like rhythm. Dan stumbled beside me, pressing his hands against his ears. "Jesus!" And then a gunshot. The sound ripped through the air, sharp and deafening. One of the soldiers had fired at the figures in the trees. The muzzle flash lit up the darkness for a split second, and in that brief moment, I saw all of them, dozens, maybe hundreds, lining the edge of the forest, spilling out onto the rooftops, the sidewalks, the empty town. Some were human-shaped, others were not. The second the bullet tore through the air, they moved, all at once. The figures lurched forward in a single, inhuman motion, surging toward us like a tidal wave of shadow and flesh. The cricket's screeching became a high-pitched whine, rattling my skull like an alarm deep in my brain. My limbs felt heavy, my thoughts fogged. Something was happening to me, to all of us. "Fall back," Harris shouted. His men were already moving, forming a defensive line near the trucks. I tried to run, My body wasn't responding. My legs felt like they were wading through thick, invisible sludge. The frequencies, they weren't just sound anymore. They were doing something to us. Dan grabbed me by the arm, practically dragging me toward the vehicles. Move, move, move. Behind us, the things kept coming. The first casualties. The first soldier to go down was Ramirez. He hesitated a second too long, his movements sluggish, uncoordinated. One of the figures reached him before he could react. It moved too fast, a blur of limbs and snapping joints. By the time we turned back, Ramirez was already on the ground. His rifle lay in the dirt, untouched. His body twitched, convulsing violently. The thing that had grabbed him, it was kneeling over him. Its mouth wasn't biting. It was pressed against his ear, whispering, a rapid, clicking series of sounds. Ramirez's pupils dilated. His chest rose and fell rapidly. Then, in the span of a heartbeat, he stopped fighting. He lay still. Then he sat up, and his mouth began to move. The same horrible chirping sound spilled from his throat, like he'd always known how to make it, like it was natural. I felt bile rise in my throat. Jesus Christ! Dan fired a shot. It hit Ramirez square in the chest. He didn't react, didn't even flinch, just turned his head toward us. The chirping grew louder. Harris grabbed my shoulder. We need to leave. Now. I didn't argue. We ran. The retreat. We barely made it inside the trucks before the swarm descended. The last thing I saw before the doors slammed shut was Ramirez and the others, standing perfectly still, watching us go. They didn't chase us. They didn't need to. The signal was already inside us. As the convoy sped down the road, my ears were still ringing. The crickets were nowhere to be seen, but I could still hear them. Deep inside my head, a crawling, rhythmic pulse, like something was settling in. Harris was on the radio barking orders. The guard was setting up a quarantine perimeter on the highway, keeping the town sealed off. It wouldn't be enough. I already knew that. The signal had changed, and it wasn't just in Millstone anymore. The broadcast, the radio crackled. First, it was just static. Then, a voice, not human, a layered, echoing whisper that slid under my skin like ice. We hear you. We are coming. We are already here. The radio exploded into static. Dan clenched his jaw. Tell me you just heard that. I nodded, my throat dry. They're broadcasting now. Dan's fingers dug into the dashboard. Then it's not just about the sound anymore. No, it wasn't. The emergency alert had changed. It wasn't just a warning to avoid crickets. It was something more, something final. Emergency alert. The signal is no longer contained. It is replicating. Do not listen. Do not respond. Harris looked at me, his expression grim. What does that mean? I swallowed hard. It means. My voice came out hoarse. It means this isn't just an isolated incident anymore. Dan exhaled sharply. It means we just lost. I didn't answer, because he was right. The final realization. The convoy pushed forward, breaking past the quarantine zone. We weren't safe yet, but we were out, for now. As we passed an old gas station on the highway, I glanced at the neon sign in the window. It flickered, glowed, then, for a fraction of a second, changed. The letters warped, twisting into something else. Not English, not words, but I could understand it. A message, a warning. You are already listening. I blinked. The letters were normal again. Just an old, flickering sign. A cold chill crawled down my spine. The crickets had stopped, but I could still hear them. In the silence, in my head, in me. And that's when I realized this wasn't a battle anymore. It wasn't a fight we could win. It was too late. We had already heard the signal, and now we belonged to it. I kept my eyes shut, tight, like if I just ignored the sound, it would go away. It didn't. The chirping was still there. Not outside. Not in the trees. Inside me. A rhythmic clicking, buried somewhere deep in my skull. No one else in the convoy was speaking. We were all just sitting in the dim, bouncing light of the truck's interior, letting the reality settle in. Dan was beside me, his breathing uneven. Sheriff Vickers sat across from us, gripping the edge of her seat, looking like she might be sick. Harris was at the front, listening to the radio, jaw tight. I knew what we were all thinking. We heard it, and now it was inside us. I didn't know what that meant yet, but I could feel it. Presence. A whispering thing, curled up somewhere in my thoughts. Waiting. Military safe zone, zone echo. We pulled into the National Guard's containment camp just before dawn. A perimeter had already been set up. Rows of barbed wire, barricades, and floodlights stretched across the highway. Soldiers moved in tight formations, scanning the trees with rifles ready. This wasn't a rescue camp. This was a war zone. We were escorted out of the trucks and immediately separated. Dan resisted at first. "Hey, where the hell are you taking?" Screening. Harris's voice was cold. "Standard protocol." The word made my stomach sink. Screening. They wanted to know if we were compromised. I was led into a small, sterile medical tent. The air smelled like antiseptic and burnt plastic. 2 men in hazmat suits stood by the entrance. A doctor, pale, exhausted, approached me. He had dark circles under his eyes, like he hadn't slept in days. "Dr. Mercer, correct?" I nodded. He scribbled something on a clipboard. "Have you experienced any of the following symptoms?" He began listing them. Auditory hallucinations, involuntary muscle spasms, unusual vocalizations. I felt ice crawl through my veins, because I already knew where this was going. "Doctor," I cut him off. "What happens if I say yes?" The man didn't answer. He just looked at me, and in that moment, I realized the truth. They didn't bring us here to help us. They brought us here to contain us. The others, they took my blood, ran tests, asked more questions. I lied. I told them I was fine, that I couldn't hear anything, that the sound wasn't still in my head, crawling like a living thing. It didn't matter, because they weren't just watching me. They were watching all of us. The other survivors, the ones they'd pulled from Millstone before the lockdown, were housed in separate containment tents. I saw them through a slit in the canvas. Some of them were sitting perfectly still, staring at the walls. Others were whispering, mouthing something soundless, their lips moving in perfect sync. One man, a younger guy, maybe in his 20s, was convulsing. Not violently, not like a seizure. It was subtle. A faint, rhythmic twitch, like something was pulling his muscles in time with a metronome. I turned away, bile rising in my throat. I had a feeling that whatever was happening to them was happening to me too. Dan's escape plan. Hours passed before I saw Dan again. They finally let us regroup in a secured debriefing tent. The mood was tense, suffocating. Sheriff Vickers was pacing. Harris was speaking in low tones with another officer, their expressions grim. Dan sat beside me, his knee bouncing anxiously. "They're not letting anyone leave," he muttered under his breath. I swallowed. Figured as much. He ran a hand through his hair. "This isn't a quarantine. It's a goddamn prison." He wasn't wrong. We were in Zone Echo, a military checkpoint meant for biological containment. No one was coming in, and no one was getting out. Dan's voice dropped lower. "I don't think they're gonna let us walk away from this." "Then what do we do?" I asked. He hesitated. Then he leaned in. "I have an idea. The experiment." Before Dan could explain, the alarm started blaring. A soldier ran into the tent, breathless. "Sir, we have a problem." Harris stood. "What is it?" "The patients." The soldier's face was pale. "They're synchronizing." My blood turned to ice. We followed him outside, moving quickly toward the medical containment units. The survivors from Millstone were lined up, standing in the dirt, facing the same direction. All of them, their eyes were glassy, their mouths were moving, clicking, one after the other in perfect unison. And then they turned, all at once. Their heads snapped toward the nearest speaker, one of the military radio towers broadcasting static over the base. The sound changed. A new frequency bled through. A voice, soft, distant. "You are listening. You are becoming." The survivors opened their mouths and spoke as one. "So are you." A sharp, unnatural spike of sound erupted from the speakers. The floodlights flickered. A high-pitched whine pierced the air, and in that moment, I felt something shift inside me, like a thread snapping. A flood of static rushed through my skull. I staggered back, clutching my head. My vision blurred. My fingers twitched, a shuddering, insect-like movement. I could feel it now. Not just a sound, not just a signal, presence. It wasn't just inside my head anymore. It was waking up, and it was hungry. I gasped, forcing myself to focus. I looked at Dan. He was staring at me, eyes wide, and I knew he heard it too. Dan's mouth was moving. His lips trembled, forming silent shapes. I knew what he was saying because I could hear it in my own head. The same clicking rhythm, the same inhuman whispers. You are listening. You are becoming. I gritted my teeth and slammed my hands over my ears. It didn't help. The sound wasn't outside. It was inside me, inside all of us. The floodlights buzzed violently. The high-pitched whine from the radio tower rose into an unbearable, almost ultrasonic frequency. The survivors standing in formation didn't react. They just stood there, twitching in the same eerie, synchronized rhythm. Dan's face twisted in panic. His fingers dug into my arm. We need to leave. Now, I nodded, barely able to think through the noise. That's when the first gunshot rang out. A soldier. He fired directly into the crowd of infected survivors. The bullet hit one square in the chest. A man who had once been human. The impact should have knocked him down, should have caused pain or at least some kind of reaction. But he didn't move, didn't flinch, didn't bleed. He just slowly tilted his head toward us. Then all at once, the others did the same, their mouths still moving, their whispers crawling into our heads. That's when they began to advance. The breakout, open fire. Harris's command ripped through the air, but I barely heard it over the gunfire. The soldiers unloaded their weapons, the flash of muzzle fire tearing through the darkness. It didn't matter. The infected survivors didn't stop, didn't react. They kept walking, moving in that same rhythmic, unnatural way. And then one of them, the young man who had been convulsing earlier, opened his mouth, wider than should have been physically possible. A distorted chirp erupted from his throat. The frequency hit like a shockwave. I collapsed to my knees, clutching my skull as a deep, suffocating pressure crushed my mind. Around me, I heard the soldiers screaming, their bodies seizing violently as their weapons dropped from their hands. One of them, Ramirez, or what had once been Ramirez, stepped forward and placed his hand against a soldier's head. Not an attack, a gesture. His fingers trembled, vibrating, almost imperceptibly. The soldier stopped struggling. His breath hitched. Then, after a single, shuddering second, he exhaled, and his mouth started moving. The clicking joined the rest. Dan grabbed my arm, dragging me to my feet. We have to move. Harris was already backing toward the armored vehicles, barking orders into his radio. The remaining uninfected soldiers were retreating, trying to regroup. But I knew the truth. This wasn't a battle. It was a spread, a contagion, and we were losing. The last transmission. As we sprinted toward the convoy, I caught a glimpse of the military's command tent. A radio operator was still inside, desperately trying to send out a final transmission. I could hear him, his voice tight with panic, requesting immediate reinforcement. Sector Echo is compromised. Repeat, Zone Echo has failed. The signal is. A loud crack of static cut him off. Then, through the speakers, a voice that wasn't his, soft, distant. No reinforcement is coming. There is only the sound, and you are listening. Then, silence. The radio operator's body jerked once. A violent twitch. He turned his head toward me, his eyes unfocused, his lips parted. A slow, chittering whisper spilled out. I stumbled back. Dan yanked me toward the nearest truck, shoving me inside as Harris climbed into the front seat. The convoy was already in motion, speeding toward the outer perimeter. The infected survivors did not chase us. They didn't need to. We had already heard the sound. The evacuation attempt. The convoy tore down the highway, past the last checkpoint. Harris was gripping the wheel, his face pale. We're heading to the next safe zone. Command still has a containment team in. A new sound interrupted him. The radio crackled, sputtering with interference. Then slowly, a familiar sound. Crickets, chirping, rhythmic, persistent. My heart dropped. No, Dan whispered. No, 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 that's not possible. Harris reached for the radio, his hand trembling. As soon as he touched it, the static cut out. A voice took its place, soft, echoing, but closer this time. There is nowhere left to go. You have already heard us, and now we are inside you. The truck swerved violently as Harris yanked his hands off the wheel. His body jerked violently, spasming in his seat. Then he let out a slow, shuddering breath, and his mouth began to move, clicking, whispering, repeating the sound. The truck veered off the road. Dan lunged forward, grabbing the wheel before we could crash. I grabbed Harris, shaking him. Snap out of it. His eyes rolled back. His lips kept moving. Dan gritted his teeth, fighting for control of the vehicle. He's gone. We have to keep moving. The headlights cut through the darkness. Up ahead, a military roadblock. Soldiers, weapons raised. But before I could breathe in relief, I saw it. One of them, a soldier at the front of the checkpoint, his head twitched, his lips moved, and through the speakers, his voice echoed into the night. You are already listening. The radio exploded into static. Dan's grip tightened on the wheel. I could see the realization on his face. This wasn't a containment effort anymore. This wasn't a fight we could win. The sound had already spread, and now there was nowhere left to run. The roadblock ahead wasn't just a checkpoint. It was a trap. Soldiers stood in formation, weapons raised, but I could see the truth in the way they stood. Too still, their heads tilting in that slow, unnatural way. They weren't guarding anything. They were waiting for us, for the sound to reach us, for us to join them. Dan gritted his teeth, gripping the wheel. What do we do? I glanced at Harris. His lips were still moving, muttering the clicking whispers under his breath. His hands twitched in sync with the rhythm. We didn't have time. Punch through it, I said. Dan's knuckles turned white. He didn't hesitate. The truck roared forward, the engine screaming as we charged the line of infected soldiers. The moment we got close, they moved, not to shoot, not to stop us, to speak. Their mouths all opened at once, and the chirping sound erupted in a wave of inhuman noise. The air rippled, the windshield cracked. I felt my brain shake inside my skull, my thoughts scattering like a swarm of insects. Dan didn't stop. The truck slammed through the barricade, plowing through bodies. Some of them went down, others didn't. One, an older soldier, his eyes glassy and mouth twitching, landed on the hood. His body convulsed, but his lips never stopped moving. Dan swerved hard, throwing him off. The moment we were past the roadblock, I forced myself to look back. The soldiers weren't chasing us. They were just standing there, watching, clicking, like they already knew we'd be back. Harris's condition. Harris was worsening. His eyes rolled back every few seconds, like he was getting caught between two places, here and somewhere else. His mouth never stopped moving. First, it was a whisper. Now, the clicking was louder, faster. Dan kept checking the rearview mirror, his expression tight. If he turns, we can't keep him in the truck. I clenched my jaw. He's still in there. Yeah. Dan's voice was sharp. Because it looks like he's already one of them. I turned to Harris, gripped his shoulder. Harris, I said, if you can hear me, fight this. For a moment, I thought he was too far gone, but then his eyes snapped forward, focused. Sweat dripped down his forehead. His whole body was trembling. They're not speaking, he gasped. My stomach twisted. What? He shuddered. It's not speech. It's code. Dan shot me a glance. The hell does that mean? Harris grabbed my arm. His fingers were like ice. They're not saying words, he rasped. It's a transmission, a signal. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The survivors weren't just infected. They were spreading it, and we had already heard it. The next safe zone. We had one option left. The final military checkpoint, Zone Bravo. If any containment teams were left, that's where they'd be. Dan drove in silence, his jaw locked. Harris was fading in and out, his breathing shallow. The closer we got to Zone Bravo, the more I felt something in my skull tighten, like a coil winding, a pulse of sound waiting to be released. We had heard it, and now it was becoming part of us. The abandoned checkpoint. When we reached Zone Bravo, I knew immediately we were too late. The checkpoint was still standing. The barbed wire, the floodlights, the radio tower, all still there. But the people were gone. No gunfire, no bodies, just silence. And then, as we stepped out of the truck, the radios in the checkpoint crackled to life. Not static, not words, the sound of crickets. Dan froze. Harris let out a shuddering breath. The wind picked up, rustling the trees. And that's when I saw them, a row of figures, standing just beyond the floodlights. Their bodies were barely visible, half shrouded in the trees. But I could see their faces, blank, expressionless, their mouths moving in unison. The sound grew louder. Dan raised his gun. Back in the truck. I didn't argue. We moved fast, shoving Harris inside as the figures began to move. The moment Dan hit the gas, they spoke, all at once. You are already listening. You are already becoming. The truck stalled. Dan cursed, trying to turn the key. The floodlights shattered. Darkness swallowed us. And in that black void, the sound of clicking filled the air. The change begins. Something was wrong with me. I could feel it now. My fingers twitched, not just shaking, moving in rhythm with the sound. I clenched my hands into fists, trying to stop it. Dan, I whispered. He was breathing hard, gripping the wheel so tight his knuckles had gone white. I know, he muttered. Harris was shaking, his body convulsing. The sound was getting inside us, not just in our ears, in our bones, our minds. And then the radio cut out, just for a second. And in that second, I heard something new. Not words, not clicks, a scream, distant, buried in static. Someone was still alive. Dan heard it too. His gaze snapped to me. That's coming from the tower, he said. I nodded. If someone was still out there, if they knew what was happening, we needed to find them before the sound took us too. The scream from the radio cut through the static like a dying breath. Dan and I locked eyes. That was a human scream. Someone was still alive, still fighting the sound. The transmission had come from the radio tower at the far end of Zone Bravo. Beyond the abandoned checkpoint, past the floodlights that had shattered into darkness. A flicker of hope, or a trap. Dan wasn't hesitating. He threw the truck into gear, trying again to start the engine. It didn't turn over, just a sputter, then silence. I clenched my teeth. It's dead. Dan slammed the dashboard. We're going on foot. I turned to Harris. His breathing was shallow, his face drenched in sweat. The clicking sounds still poured from his lips. But something was different now. The rhythm was breaking, the pattern out of sync, like he was fighting it. Harris, I whispered. We're getting to the tower. Can you move? His head twitched. His mouth opened and closed like he was trying to speak. Then slowly, he nodded. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Then let's go. Into the darkness. We left the truck behind. The checkpoint was a graveyard. Empty. No bodies. No blood. No signs of a struggle. Just abandoned gear. Guns. Radios. Military vehicles, doors wide open. Like the soldiers had just walked away. Disappeared into the sound. Dan had his rifle raised, sweeping the area. Stay close. I did. Harris stumbled beside me, muttering under his breath. The clicking had faded to almost nothing, but I could feel it in him, in me, a vibration in my skull, the urge to move in sync with the rhythm. I bit the inside of my cheek hard enough to draw blood. Pain helped, kept me grounded. We reached the radio tower in under a minute, but it felt like hours. The door was open. A faint red light pulsed inside. Someone was still in there, or something. Dan exhaled. Ready, I nodded. We stepped inside. The last operator. The first thing I noticed was the smell. Sweat, metal, and something else. Something rotting. The radio room was a mess of scattered papers and broken equipment. The broadcast console still hummed with weak static. And slumped against the far wall, a man, still alive, barely. His uniform was torn, stained with blood. His left arm was twisted at an unnatural angle, but his eyes were clear, not glassy, not empty. He hadn't turned, yet Dan rushed forward, kneeling beside him. What happened? The man shuddered. His lips parted. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. You heard it, didn't you? My stomach dropped. I forced a nod. We're trying to stop it. A ragged breath. You can't. Dan's grip on his rifle tightened. What do you mean? The man swallowed, his throat working like it hurt just to breathe. It's not a disease, he rasped. Not a parasite. not a virus. His eyes flicked to mine. It's an idea. I stared at him. Dan's expression darkened. That's not possible. The man let out a weak, bitter laugh. You still think in terms of what's possible? His voice shook. You don't understand what you're dealing with. He coughed. Blood speckled his lips. It doesn't just infect the body, he whispered. It infects perception. The words sent a cold spike through my chest. I thought of the voices, the rhythmic clicking, the way it was spreading even through the radio. You heard it, the man said again. That means it's already in you. Dan stood abruptly. There has to be a way to stop it. The man didn't answer. His eyes were losing focus. His lips moved, not clicking, just one final whisper. Stop the transmission. Then his body went still. Dan exhaled sharply, stepping back. I forced myself to look away. Harris let out a shaking breath. Look, he whispered. I turned, saw what he was pointing at. The radio console. A single frequency was still active, transmitting. The same one from the checkpoint, the same one from the emergency alerts, the signal, spreading the sound. I stepped forward, my heart hammering. If this was the source, we could shut it down. I reached for the broadcast switch, then I froze, because for the first time I realized the console was still receiving, not just transmitting. Something else was on the other end, listening, waiting, and then the radio crackled. A voice came through, not static, not a whisper, a new voice, calm, measured. You've come so far, but you already know the truth. You can't stop this, because you are already part of it. Dan grabbed my arm. Turn it off. I hesitated. The voice felt like it was crawling through me, not outside, inside. Harris let out a strangled gasp. His body convulsed. Dan shouted my name. I gritted my teeth and flipped the switch. The radio died. The sound cut off. The red emergency lights flickered. Then a deep, low hum vibrated through the floor, like something waking up. Imet Denes Gazi. Neither of us spoke. We didn't need to, because we both felt it. We had shut off the signal, but it wasn't enough. The sound was still inside us. And now, something else was too. Silence. Not real silence. The kind that hums beneath the skin, vibrating in the bones. The kind that isn't truly empty. We had shut down the transmission, but the sound wasn't gone. It was inside us. Dan was the first to break the quiet. Did it work? His voice was tight, like he already knew the answer but needed to ask anyway. Harris was shaking. His breath came in ragged gasps. His fingers twitched against his knees, his body struggling against something we couldn't see. Then he spoke. It's not over. I turned to him, my stomach sinking. What do you mean? Harris lifted his head slowly. His eyes were bloodshot but clear. The transmission wasn't just broadcasting, he rasped. It was listening. A cold weight pressed down on my chest. Dan clenched his jaw. Listening to what? Harris swallowed. His gaze flicked to the radio console. Us. The signal never ends. The words hung heavy in the air. We had been so focused on shutting down the broadcast that we never stopped to think. What if it had already spread too far? Harris pressed a shaking hand against his temple. We were the ones amplifying it. Every time we repeated the sound, every time we thought about it, it got stronger. Dan's expression darkened. That doesn't make sense. Harris gave a weak, bitter laugh. Neither does a sound that hijacks your brain and turns you into part of a hive mind. But here we are. I felt something coil in my skull, a tight, lingering pressure, like a song stuck in my head, a rhythm I couldn't shake. Even with the transmission off, the sound remained. I clenched my fists. So how do we stop it? Harris exhaled. You don't. I stared at him. Dan took a step forward. That's not good enough. Harris shook his head. You don't get it, he whispered. It's not a disease, not a signal. It's an idea. I thought back to what the soldier had said before he died. It infects perception, not just sound. Thought. You can kill a virus, Harris murmured. You can burn a body, quarantine a city, but you can't stop an idea. He lifted his hands. They were trembling. Dan and I watched in horror as his fingers twitched. Click, click, click. A perfect imitation of the sound. His face contorted in pain. I can't stop hearing it, he choked out. Even with the broadcast off, it's still there. It's still spreading. My pulse pounded. Dan lifted his gun. I grabbed his wrist. No, his eyes were wide, wild. If he turns, he's not turning. My voice was firm. He's fighting it. Dan didn't lower the gun, but he didn't fire. Harris's body shuddered. His lips moved like he was about to speak. Then the building shook. Something else is listening. The low hum we'd felt before returned, but this time it was deeper, stronger, a vibration through the walls. The floor, like something massive, had turned its attention to us. Dan whirled toward the door. We need to move. I grabbed Harris, helping him up. His body was ice cold, but he was still with us. We stepped outside. The air was wrong. The checkpoint, the trees, the road stretching into the dark. It all felt too still, like the world was holding its breath. Then the first voice spoke, not from a radio, not from a person, from everywhere. You are still listening. I felt my knees buckle. The air hummed with the words, like the sound wasn't coming from outside. It was inside us. You have carried us far. Dan cursed under his breath. Run, the final escape. We sprinted past the abandoned checkpoint, the empty military vehicles, toward the tree line. Dan didn't stop. I didn't stop. Harris stumbled, gasping, but I yanked him forward. The voices followed. There is no distance, no escape. You will carry the sound to them. I bit down hard on my tongue. Pain kept me grounded. Dan reached the edge of the woods first. He turned back, and his face paled. I turned too, and I saw them, hundreds, standing in the open just beyond the checkpoint, silent, watching. Their mouths weren't moving. They didn't have to. We had already heard. Dan grabbed my arm, yanking me forward. Move! We plunged into the trees. Branches slashed at my face. The night was thick and endless. I didn't know where we were going, only that we had to keep moving. Harris was muttering again, but now his voice was different. He wasn't clicking. He was repeating words, over and over. A single phrase. Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Don't think about it. Dan and I didn't question it. We just kept running. The end or the beginning. I don't know how long we ran. Minutes. Hours. By the time we stopped, my lungs felt torn. My legs ached. Harris collapsed against a tree, his breath ragged. Dan bent over, hands on his knees. We didn't speak for a long time. Finally, Dan exhaled. Do you still hear it? I closed my eyes, listened. The forest was quiet. No voices, no clicks, but deep in my mind, beneath my thoughts, something still hummed. A lingering echo, faint, distant, but there. Harris let out a breath. It's never going away, is it? Dan didn't answer. Neither did I, because we already knew the truth. We had escaped, but we would never be free. And somewhere in another town, another city, someone else would hear the sound, and it would start again.